So please give a warm welcome to Timothy Good.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for that warm welcome. Now, although I'll be dealing to an extent with highly advanced technology in my presentation this morning, unfortunately, we are committed to ancient technology for the presentation, the visual presentation thereof, because I still live in the 20th century regarding presentations. PowerPoint, I'm not quite up to yet. My girlfriend insists I really start soon, but there we are. She's very insistent on that. But for the meantime, there'll be slides. We did have some problems with the rented slide projector, so we just cross fingers and hope for the best. Just a brief overview. The fact that they say there's nothing new under the sun. I say aliens have always been here. And they've been here before we were. Many of them. Not all, many of them. And it's interesting that many artists, particularly in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, often portrayed biblical events in terms of craft from elsewhere. This is a 13th century French painting, and look how interesting that craft is compared to modern day sightings. This is just a nobleman on his horse pointing out to the rest of his team of riders. Here's a 15th century painting with enlargements showing the Madonna with St. John, and in the sky is this, enlarged here, with this guy here looking up at it. Isn't that interesting? And I hope you can see, I hope it's not too over-illuminated by this powerful light here, but this is a painting by the famous Dutch painter, Ert de Gelder, which I find interesting. And I think if you look at that, that is clearly a solid disc of some sort, beaming down rays of light to the infant Christ. I thought I'd have to bring in Dutch material at some point in this talk, so that's it, probably for the rest of the morning. You'll often hear, even in presentations by well-informed speakers, that the Americans were the first to initiate official UFO investigations. Rubbish. They started in the 1930s in Sweden. A few were in the United Kingdom, and a few were actually in America in the 1930s, when they became inundated with sightings of mystery aeroplanes. Very bizarre events. But the most interesting for me was that in 1933, a top secret investigation group into unknown aerial phenomena was established by Mussolini, and they set up a top secret team called Research Unit, Special Research Unit number 33, headed by the famous Italian engineer Marconi. And there were quite a few members of that, including astronomers. And this was a highly classified document stating that this report of a landed vehicle on Italian soil, and a landed vehicle of unknown origin, it wasn't a conventional aircraft, must not leak out to the press. And that hence this extraordinary top-secret commission was set up. And this is a very well-known violinist, certainly more well-known than I was. His name is Mussolini. Seriously. He actually was a pilot. I don't know how many of you know of that. Most people wondered how on earth he could get inside the aircraft that he piloted. But at any rate, he was a talented guy, and because of his fascination with aircraft, he became immediately hooked on the UFO situation as early as 1933. And there were sightings by Royal Italian Air Force pilots after this event, including 1935, 1936. This is a British Lancaster bomber in World War II. It was our principal bomber. Now, you've all heard about the Foo Fighters, these so-called things which appeared mostly to be remotely controlled devices which buzzed aircraft in all theaters of war, in Japan, the European theater, in the Pacific theater. I might even have a photograph of one here, but perhaps not. Now, I want to discuss the fact that not just Foo Fighters were observed in World War II. Sometimes very large craft, including in one case by another Lancaster crew, of a cigar-shaped object, and in this case, a sighting in 1944 over France, following a bombing run. The entire crew encountered a grey disc. It was huge, they said. And this is a sketch by the radar observer showing the craft on edge. And there is the Lancaster bomber he drew for comparison. He said it was there for 3 minutes and then it shot off at phenomenal speed. What's interesting is that I received this letter via this radar observer and radio operator. He said that the captain said, "What the hell's that?" The radar screen went blank, and this observer, in his 360-degree astrodome, as it was called, saw this thing. He said it seemed miles in width, and our Lancaster, he said, was a large aeroplane, but the only comparison I can make is that we were but a dot on a sheet of foolscap paper. And after 3 minutes, it shot away. Most interestingly, the entire crew felt suffused by an unprecedented, in their case, sense of calm and well-being. What that meant, we don't know, but that is their story. Now, of course, we've had a superb presentation on the Nazis coming over here, developing the American space program, and presumably the Soviets as well. Many of you are aware that in 1942 the Americans tried to shoot down a large flying craft over Los Angeles. This was observed by well over 1 million people during a 5-hour air alarm. And a secret memorandum was sent to President Roosevelt by General George Marshall, United States Army Chief of Staff at that time, confirming that, something like 1,430 rounds of anti-aircraft shells were fired at this object, but nothing appeared to be struck or come down. And there were other objects sighted as well. But let's fast forward. In 1947, when the Americans, thanks to Paperclip, were developing the V-2 program, having brought the captured V-2 rockets over to White Sands Missile Ground, from the beginning, from the inception of the space program, when these V-2 rockets were launched, on many occasions, small discs, or sometimes larger discs, were seen shooting round these rockets, and on at least one occasion, one of the rockets was forced to come down prematurely by this disk. It had obviously influenced the guiding system in some way. And this was officially acknowledged at that time. This is a local newspaper in New Mexico commenting. German V-2 rocket launched at White Sands Proving Grounds Thursday afternoon, landed only 6 miles east of Alamogordo. The peculiar phenomena were blamed by Lieutenant Colonel Harold Turner, commanding officer of White Sands, for the, I can't read it myself, erratic test flight, I think. Is that correct? Yeah. And so this was officially acknowledged. What happened then was that the Americans renewed their efforts to try and shoot down some of these flying discs. This was before they started referring to them as flying saucers. That came a little bit later. And they were apparently successful. My information is that a number of these craft were successfully shot down, including the ones that came down in the approximately Roswell, New Mexico area. There were other events as well. To which people respond to me, Tim, how is it possible that these craft, which are so incredibly sophisticated, would come all this way to be shot down by our primitive shells? Well, according to the aliens themselves, or at least some groups, whereas they are more than capable of handling any electronic or remotely guided missile or any kind of projectile shell sent at them, they were not capable of dealing with conventional anti-aircraft shells. Anyway, when the Americans started firing at these things, they retaliated big time. This story has really not come out properly. I have published it in my book, Need to Know, thanks to a great deal of information provided for me by Andy Kistner, a former representative for Las Cruces, New Mexico, and an engineer with an aerospace background. And he did a tremendous amount of research and very kindly provided the results of his research to me. It indicates that there were many hundreds all over the world of mysterious accidents, not just involving military aircraft, but airliners, some of which, with ordinary passengers on board, were sometimes unable to take off, they could not unstick from the runway, and they crashed at the end with large losses of life. This was retaliation by some alien craft. And it went on for quite a time, and there has been a conflict situation ever since. All this was happening. This is just in one story, worldwide series of disastrous crack-ups, not just United States, worldwide. Planes like, for example, fighter planes that were flying in formation suddenly seemed to be thrown together so that the whole lot crashed together. And of course, Roswell, I'm not going to go into that. You all know everything that there is to need, I'm quite sure. We know that, first of all, there was an official press release to the effect that the Roswell Army Airfield had recovered a flying disc. And then the next day, of course, it created tremendous excitement worldwide. And the next day, General Ramey said, oh, it's absolute nonsense. It was just a balloon. And that is the official position of the United States government to this day, despite the fact there isn't anything to support that ridiculous theory. So, why did they insist on a cover-up at this time? This is General Clements McMullen. He was Deputy Commander of Strategic Air Command at the time. And he was partly responsible for the balloon cover story. But this is what he said, according to Brigadier General Dubose. He said, "We'd just gone through a world war. We had seen the firebombing of great cities, atomic bombs, destruction on an unprecedented scale. Then came this flying saucer business. It was just too much for the public to have to deal with." Well, how thoughtful. I can see their point, but at some level, you can rest assured the military were absolutely frantic about what was going on, even if they didn't admit as much. Many of you will not be familiar with the testimony of a Polish biophysicist who in 1974, together with a small international team, British scientist, French scientist, and an Italian scientist, and a Polish biophysicist, they're all biophysicists, liaising with NASA, and they had been given by NASA in 1974 actual pieces from an alien captured craft. They weren't told what it was, but they all came to the same conclusion when they performed tests on this thing. Phenomenal metal, for example, that melting point was well above 2,000 degrees Celsius, and so on and so forth. And they were told that these bits came from the Iron Curtain. In 1977, they were invited to the NASA's Jet Propulsion Center in Pasadena, California. And there, they were shown these remains of one or more of the small creatures that were found, and it doesn't say where. They were told one of 2 incidents in New Mexico. And it was obviously the skeletal structure of a small creature. They give quite an amount of information that they learnt, for example, that there had been one survivor, at least in one of these 2 incidents in New Mexico. They found their blood was similar to ours, but showed a totally different reaction toward oxygen. So nitrogen was no good for them, so therefore they assumed that they must breathe a mixture of helium and oxygen on board their craft. Why do you think it is that there was a massive build-up of sightings during and following World War II? I'm sure many of you will know the answer. I think you're correct. We were not only developing atomic bombs, but we were fast developing hydrogen bombs. And in 1948, a previously secret Project Sign report, American report, stated as follows: "Such a civilization might observe that on Earth we now have atomic bombs and are fast developing rockets. In view of the past history of mankind, they should be alarmed, and we should therefore expect at this time above all to behold such visitations." This is part of a top secret United States Air Force's Europe document relating to discussions with their Swedish counterparts. And some of the information in the second paragraph in particular is very interesting. The Swedes thought that some reliable and fully technically qualified Swedes have reached the conclusion that these phenomena are obviously the result of a high technical skill which cannot be credited to any presently known culture on Earth. They are therefore assuming that these objects originate from some previously known or unidentified technology, possibly outside the Earth. I think many of you are familiar with the Canadian government scientist and engineer Wilbert Smith, who in a top secret Canadian government document stated that the matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher even than the hydrogen bomb. Flying saucers exist. Their method of operation, modus operandi, is unknown, but concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. The entire matter is considered by the United States authorities to be of tremendous significance. And indeed, it was significant that a small group was to be headed by Vannevar Bush because he was one of the prime movers of the project, the Manhattan Engineering District, that was the code name, project to develop the world's first nuclear weapons. And I can tell you that even not just at that time, but ever since that time, the concentration of effort studying and controlling this subject resides in those who deal with the nuclear business. This is another top secret document which you might not be familiar with, from Wilbert Smith, the Canadian scientist and engineer. They were talking about, they want to get clearance for Smith to visit the appropriate service in the United States to discuss the use of terrestrial magnetic forces in relation to aerodynamic problems associated with saucer-shaped objects. And Wilbert Smith's source for the information about the supreme high secrecy of the subject and the fact that it was all very real was given to Smith by Dr. Robert Sarbacher. This is a Canadian flying saucer. You're probably familiar with the so-called Avro car. This is one of John Frost's special groups. This is the special projects group that actually handled this thing. Some people say it was a prototype of a flying saucer. Others say it was deliberately constructed so as to let the American and other countries, presumably public, know that, they're ours, really, that you're seeing. We don't know. Except that, how many of you have seen this photograph? Anybody here? I don't think I saw a hand. You did? You've seen it? You've not seen it? Maybe, possibly. Okay. We don't know anything about this thing except that it was produced by Avro Canada. We don't know who this guy is here. I don't even know if it flew or not, but it's interesting that they actually used a canopy which is, it's actually lifted from an F-86 Sabre jet, which I find intriguing. I'd love to know what the control systems were and exactly what it was propelled by, if it ever flew. Now, I'm always asked how I became interested in flying saucers. Well, in 1955, I was given a book on the subject by an American cousin. And this was the book he gave me, The Flying Saucers Are Real by Major Donald Kehoe. And I was immediately hooked. I knew nothing about the subject, but I've always been passionate about aviation and space travel. I mean, I used to get adult flying magazines when I was 10 years old regularly. I used to go to air shows like Farnborough and so forth. And I was immediately hooked on the fact that so many reports were coming from pilots, military pilots, airline pilots, supported by air traffic controllers, which means radar, of course. And then in 1961, while I was a student at the Royal Academy of Music, I started to do my own serious research. This was after reading Captain Edward Ruppelt's book, called the Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. Ruppelt was an intelligence officer at the Pentagon, and he came out in that book, taking quite a risk at that time, saying it was all very real, they were here, and so on, and that some of them had been shot at, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the many problems associated with our subject are the hundreds, if not thousands, of missing aircraft and pilots. This one in particular has always intrigued me. 1953 at Otis Air Force Base, an F-96 Starfire was scrambled to investigate a flying saucer over the airbase. This was happening every day in the 1950s. And many of the cases were reported in local and sometimes national newspapers. Well, the pilot and the radar observer in the rear took off. They got to about 1,100 feet. They got approaching this disk, which was hovering over the base, when everything conked out. Engine stopped, electronic power failure, the whole lot. The plane started dropping. They had to get out. Well, in theory, the radar observer is supposed to jump out first, then the captain. I don't know whether that's a naval custom tradition carried on with the United States Air Force, but anyway, in this case, the captain jumped out because there was some struggle with at the back there with the back seater, as they sometimes call them. Right. The pilot landed safely. Thank heavens his parachute opened just in time. And he expected fully to see his radar observer land not that far from him. He never saw the radar observer or his parachute or the aircraft. The aircraft did not crash. It disappeared. It was never found. Neither was the radar observer. The only thing, apart from the pilot that came down, was the radar canopy, which of course has to be ejected prior to the pilot's ejecting. Now, I obtained these figures indirectly. I didn't get them directly, but they were obtained by a very fine researcher in South America, in Brazil at the time actually, and he had asked for an accident breakdown of accidents to aircraft from 1952 to 1956. All right? And just involving Air Force and Navy planes. All right? Of this astonishing total of 18,662 accidents during that period, most involved fast new jets. This is what I've written here, such as those scrambled in UFO interceptions, of which 56% were found to be caused by pilot error, 8% approximately by ground crew or other personnel failure, 23.4% by failure of parts and equipment in the aircraft, 2.8% by various unsafe conditions, and 9.5%, 1,773, due to unknown factors. So that is officially admitted. Doesn't mean to say they were aliens from outer space, but unknown factors of mysterious disappearances and accidents. Now, people often ask me, why is it that so few people in governments or the military come forward and discuss their sightings? Well, increasingly, I think you're well aware that they are beginning to do so. Certainly not politicians, but quite a number of military people have come forward. One or two politicians actually have indeed come forward. But this is Air Marshal Sir Peter Horsley, who I knew. He was a decorated war hero. He, at the time, this was in 1954, at the time, he was working as an equerry, kind of military attaché for the Duke of Edinburgh, and he worked also for the Queen in Buckingham Palace for a 7-year period at this time, when a British Army general arranged for Sir Peter, who had been working on the UFO problem in the Ministry of Defence, arranged for Sir Peter to meet an alien being in the middle of London. And Sir Peter Horsley went to this meeting place in Chelsea in London. There was another witness there, and he met this immaculately suited guy. And for the 2-hour meeting, a great deal of information was given. And Sir Peter told me that the most disturbing aspect of this meeting was the fact that this alien being, who looked very human, could not only read Sir Peter's mind, but he knew all Britain's top secret nuclear secrets. And a lot of information was given. I rather like some of the comments he made. Earth, after all, is a galactic backwater inhabited by only half-civilized men, dangerous even to their neighbors. They said they had highly developed mental powers, including telepathy, hypnosis, and the ability to use different dimensions. This is, of course, President Eisenhower. Some of you may have heard of his meeting in February of 1954 with extraterrestrials at Edwards Air Force Base, California, and with quite a few dignitaries were there with him who have been named and who have come forward to support this story. What is less known is that a year later, another meeting was arranged, and this took place at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. And this information, it came to me from Art Campbell. You can Google him and you can read a lot about this case. And anyway, Eisenhower supposedly went on a top-secret trip in Air Force One, and the excuse was he was going for some quail hunting with one of his high-ranking chiefs of staff or whatever, and there was quite a plane full of various journalists and so forth. And in fact, there was a meeting, and a number of witnesses have come forward, like a telephone engineer working at the base who actually saw the craft come down. It came right over the telegraph pole, and he beat a hasty retreat down with his special climate. And then the thing eventually came on the ground, hovered low at first, and the meeting took place in the craft by all accounts of the witnesses there. Now, another question people ask me is why is it that these things never land in public places? Well, there have been some dramatic cases, and this is one which if anyone here is aware of it, I'm sure a few of you are, but it's a rare case. It happened in the London suburb of Bexley Heath in July of 1955. It was 100 degrees, up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit type. It was a terrific heat wave. And a friend of mine was driving with her doctor and one of her small sons, when suddenly the sky went dark and there was the car engine conked out, and this thing landed at this crossroads here eventually, and it stayed there for quite a while, and eventually it shot off. What my friend Margaret Fry was the principal witness, but there were lots of other people. There were about 10 or 12 children playing around at the time when this thing came down. It was about 30 feet in diameter. What the people there hadn't realized was that, in fact, another craft landed just a few streets away, a slightly different type. And again, we have witness statements from people swearing to these events. It's interesting that publicly, General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, acknowledged the dangers represented by some of these beings from elsewhere. General MacArthur said he described himself as a confirmed optimist regarding the possibility of another world war. And the mayor here, the mayor of New York, was saying he thinks that another war will be double suicide and that there is enough sense on both sides of the Iron Curtain to avoid it. He believes that because of the developments of science, all the countries on Earth will have to unite to survive and to make a common front against people from other planets. Now, talking about the German scientists, this is Hermann Oberth, who in fact taught Werner von Braun, who was a protege of his. I took this picture in Germany in the 1970s. I went round for coffee and cakes. I had a delightful afternoon, and later on I invited him to a concert that we were giving at the time with the London Symphony Orchestra in Nuremberg. And he lived near Nuremberg at the time. It's very interesting that he has gone on the record as saying, we cannot take the credit for our record advancement in certain scientific fields alone. We have been helped, he stated. When asked by whom, by a reporter, he replied, the people of other worlds. And Werner von Braun, who I did not meet, in referring to the deflection from orbit of NASA's Juno 2 rocket in 1959, stated, we find ourselves faced by powers which are far stronger than we had hitherto assumed and whose base is at present unknown to us. More I cannot say at present. We are now engaged in entering into closer contact with those powers. This is Gordon Cooper. Now, in the old days, Gordon Cooper said, only a few astronauts have spotted things, but there's nothing really much in it. But in his autobiography, he describes the landing of a flying disc at Edwards Air Force Base in 1957. And at the time, Cooper was assigned as test pilot and manager with a top-secret security clearance of the Fighter Section Experimental Flight Test Engineering Division. And his camera crew came running in to tell him exactly what had happened. They said a saucer flew over them, hovered over the ground, extended 3 landing gears, then set down, metallic silver in color and shaped somewhat like an inverted plate. They'd shot images with 35mm and 4x5 still cameras, as well as motion picture film. When they tried to approach the saucer to get a closer shot, it lifted up, retracted its gear, and climbed straight out of sight. Later on, there was United Nations, several meetings, United Nations. There was a meeting in Miami, for example, of a special political committee headed by the Secretary General Kurt Waldheim to discuss the UFO question. And at that meeting, Cooper went on the record as saying that we're going to need a top-level coordinated program to scientifically collect and analyze data from all over the Earth and to determine how best to interface with these visitors in a friendly fashion. And in addition to having sighted these things and chased them in Sabre jets in Germany with US Air Forces Europe in 1951, he actually had a much more interesting sighting, and this was divulged in an interview, a recorded interview in about 1970, something like that. Sorry, 1974. I myself have encountered some of their craft while flying in space, he told this reporter. NASA knows this, and the American government knows it too. Yet they continue to keep their silence, probably in order to avoid confusing the public. For many years, I've lived with a secret, in a secrecy imposed on all specialists in astronautics. I can now reveal that every day in the USA, our radar instruments capture objects of form and composition unknown to us. I was furthermore a witness to an extraordinary phenomenon which happened a few months ago in Florida, where he lived at the time, at his home. I saw with my own eyes a defined area of ground being consumed by fire with 4 indentations left by a craft which had descended in the middle of a field. Beings had left the craft. There were other traces to prove this. They seemed to have studied the topography. They'd collected soil fragments. Thank you. Flying saucers are a reality, continued Cooper. I won't stop repeating this. The public must be prepared to make contacts with people who sooner or later will be compelled to interfere. The salvation of us all depends on it. Now, during my correspondence with Gordon Cooper, he neither confirmed nor denied the statements attributed to him contained in this interview. In a letter to Ambassador Griffith at the United Nations, Gordon Cooper made an interesting statement in which he said, "I have not yet had the privilege of flying a UFO." Now, just a few years ago, a respected colleague informed me that following the United Nations meetings in 1974 and 78, in the General Assembly in 1978, Cooper had vented his frustration at the seemingly invincible task of convincing the United Nations delegates of alien reality. What would it take, he said to this researcher friend of mine, a landed flying saucer? He then went on to claim that he himself was in a position to actually pilot a flying disc and land it himself. An outrageous claim, to be sure, but from other reliable sources, I have heard that a number of astronauts and pilots, not just in the United States, have learnt to fly alien and or alien replicated craft, and it's been going on for quite some time. Yes. This is Buzz Aldrin. How many of you are aware that he acknowledged officially that Apollo 11 was buzzed on its way to the moon? He actually said that, if I can find the statement here, maybe not. He said there was something out there that was close enough to be observed. Mike Collins was one of the 3 Apollo 11 astronauts, decided he thought he could see it in the telescope, and when you made it real sharp, it was sort of bell-shaped. Obviously, the 3 of us weren't going to blurt out, "Hey, Houston, we've got something moving alongside of us and we don't know what it is." We weren't about to do that because we knew that those transmissions would be heard by all sorts of people. And who knows, somebody would have demanded we turn back because of aliens or whatever. Well, it gets better. 2 Soviet scientists confirmed that there were large alien craft on the moon during the actual landing. This was confirmed by Soviet scientist Dr. Alexander Kazantsev, who claims that Buzz Aldrin had actually taken color movie film of the spacecraft from inside the module and continued filming them after he and Armstrong went outside. They were large, mysterious objects, watching them after they'd landed in the lunar module. In Above Top Secret, I cited the testimony of a good friend of mine who'd participated at a NASA conference in Italy in June 1984, during which she overheard in the next room Neil Armstrong discussing what had happened actually on the moon with a German professor, NASA professor. And my source has passed away now. I'll just give you her first name though, Pamela, and she'd served with Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, popularly known as MI6. She said that she made notes immediately afterwards as best she could of exactly what was said. Professor, what really happened out there? Armstrong, it was incredible. Of course, we'd always known there was a possibility. The fact is, and he gives the name of the professor, we were warned off. There was never any question of a space station or a moon city. And the professor says, how do you mean warned off? I can't go into details, said Armstrong, except to say that their ships were far superior to ours, both in size and technology. Boy, were they big and menacing. No, there's no question of a space station. Professor responds, but NASA had other missions after Apollo 11. Naturally, replied Armstrong, NASA was committed at that time and couldn't risk a panic on Earth. But it really was a quick scoop and back again. Now, at a cocktail party later that evening at the NASA conference, Pamela confronted Armstrong, who confirmed that the story was true but refused to go into further detail, beyond admitting that the CIA was behind the cover-up. She added, I asked her years later if she stood by this claim, and she said, I still stand by the Armstrong report. Like Martin Luther, I can do no other. Perfectly placed as I was in the next suite. And in light of the cover-up the United States still has in place, it surprises me not that Neil Armstrong denies it. She added that the United States has had contact since the early 1960s with a superior extraterrestrial race. Neil Armstrong. There he is. This is an interesting photograph on the moon. It's supposed to be the color-wise and clarity-wise the best that NASA could produce, and they were prints covered with a special sort of plasticized material to stop them ever changing color. And I still have this framed picture at home showing the Schmidt crater, which is towards the other side of the moon. And you can see the interesting color. Does it not have a sort of moss-like color? Would you agree? NASA said, oh no, that they were using the wrong type of film or something. Astronauts don't use the wrong type of film, and they're very careful with the way they develop slide material. This was taken with Ektachrome. Now, many of you will have heard of Philip Corso, who was, as chief of the Army's, United States Army's Foreign Technology Division, actually stewarded the engineering, the remarkable advanced engineering materials to the American industrial corporate giants, alien artifacts, integrated circuit chips, fiber optics, lasers, super tenacity fibers, and so forth. What is less known about Corso, and he didn't write about it in his book The Day After Roswell, is that in 1957, when he was in charge of the Army's firing site, missile firing range at White Sands, he had a very strange experience in which he was in a plane, a small plane, army plane, flying over a certain area in White Sands when he saw what looked like a disc on the desert ground. He assumed it was a missile booster. It was a shiny saucer-shaped object, he said, at any rate. Later he visited the site. Nothing to be seen, he said, but suddenly it materialized back and forth on the ground. He could see it sometimes very, very clearly, and other times it became invisible. Well, he chucked a rocket at it on two occasions, and it obviously hit the thing because it bounced off. And a long story short, it took off, affecting the engine of his truck. And he later on communicated telepathic, this was several weeks later, with a being of the so-called grey variety, wearing a type of helmet. And the purpose of this meeting was because in order for these missiles to be fired, they had to have what was called green time. And Corso has referred to this. When they turn off the radar in case of interference to the missiles being tested. And this alien requested telepathically green time. Would Corso ask for them to turn off the radars while they took off? And Corso managed to get the agreement of his colleagues. He was in charge after all, so that's happening. A lot of people have said, oh, you don't want to take Corso seriously. I know a lot of distinguished researchers who say, no, I could mention one famous researcher who says, no, Corso, no, he says he was in the National Security Council. That's rubbish, it's absolute rubbish, he's lied. I said to the chap, well, have you actually seen the military records of that time? And here they are. I managed to get these. Corso was on the intelligence staff for a number of years at the Special Operations Coordinating Board, which is attached to the National Security Council. And therefore, he, Corso, and anyone attached to the Special Operations Board, later known as the Special Group, would have had access to the most sensitive information dealt with by the intelligence community. He was attached to the National Security Council intelligence staff. In 1961-62, I was given information by a man who knew Kennedy that Kennedy had requested seeing the alien bodies and craft, and he was duly granted access to that extent. He was taken on a top-secret flight, so of course, people would say, well, there's no record, Tim, there's no record of Air Force One leaving. Well, when you've got a top-secret mission, you don't sort of get these things in Freedom of Information Act requests. You don't get that kind of information. And that will remain top-secret to this day. But apparently, the general in charge was General McHugh, Godfrey T. McHugh. And he took to a special Air Force base, Homestead Air Force Base in Florida, and was shown craft and bodies. I don't know any more than that. Just a photograph, can't see very clearly, but I always show this picture because people say, well, so many pictures are not clear, and admittedly we could probably have some less light, you'd see it better, but it's a flying disc, shadow on the ground. This is, thank you very much, this is a highway in the jungle in Venezuela. This is all jungle. There's the shadow of the craft. There's the shadow of a DC-4 airliner, and there is the nacelle, the propeller spinner of one of the engines. And the photograph was taken by the first officer sitting in the right-hand seat, obviously. And people have said, oh yes, it was a button on the cockpit canopy. I don't think so. Furthermore, professional topographers and mathematicians determined that all the shadows tallied with the objects depicted in the sky. I want to mention George Adamski, much maligned in many ways. A lot of the stories he came out with seem bizarre, but I've learnt, also from my own experiences, that a lot of what he said was true. One can quibble with whether the beings he encountered were actually Martians and Venusians, or as he interestingly referred to them as Venetians, or Saturnians, which doesn't inspire confidence. But what I can tell you about this man is that he was treated with remarkable seriousness by the intelligence community and by the political community. And he in fact held a United States government ordnance pass, which gave him access not just to any American Air Force base in the States, but abroad as well. He was very well connected. He met Kennedy on several times, and he arranged for Kennedy to be taken on board a craft in 1963. I think it was in May of 1963. And he was involved in all sorts of arrangements for various people to meet the so-called space people, as he referred to them sometimes. He also had not one, but two meetings with Pope John the 23rd at the Vatican shortly before the Pope passed away. You may have heard of one of them, I've written about it, but there was another one which has yet to come to light, apart from what I've just told you. I don't know any more than that. And this is a frame from an 8mm movie film taken by Adamski in the presence of Madeleine Rodefer, who passed away a few years ago, a very dear friend of mine. She was there. There were two people from the United States government present who were liaising with the aliens in the craft, which, according to an optical physicist, was 27 feet in diameter. And the craft displayed a series of jerky movements like that, and these things underneath, they're not landing gear, by the way, they hold a certain substance which is related specifically to the propulsion system, and these things were sort of going up and down and changing shape and so forth. And interestingly, there is always a distortion in the craft in the direction it's heading, as if something is arranged gravitational-wise. A gravitational field is created, and this is what causes optical distortions in the atmosphere. The craft itself does not change shape. Now, in 1998, I was invited by this man, General Kenneth Israel, who at that time was director of the Defense Airborne Reconnaissance Office, which is now really, well, it's parceled in with the National Reconnaissance Office altogether. But this was the Defense Airborne Reconnaissance Office, which at that time handled the unmanned spy planes. And I was invited to the Pentagon for a half-hour meeting. It wasn't classified. There was even a sign outside saying no classified here, but a welcoming sign for me and everything. I was expecting a one-to-one with the general. However, there were about a total of, I'd say, about 12 people in the room, mostly young members of this organization from all the various military services that were working with Daro. Now, during that meeting, General Israel made it quite clear to me that he believed that film taken in Washington, D.C. in February 1965 was absolutely genuine. And Adamski wasn't the only person to film these things. There are lots of fairly good photographs. This is an extreme enlargement of another bell-shaped craft, as they're sometimes referred to. Slightly different from the Adamski one, but a certain similarity nevertheless. Now, I want to discuss with you, I'm just going to see if I can tighten up in the focus a bit here, maybe a little bit, yeah. Extraordinary developments in Italy and the rest of the world, as a matter of fact, but there was an organization called Amicizia, which was formed in 1956. There were many people involved from all walks of life, literally all walks of life. And somewhere here I can have information, a sort of category of people we're dealing with. It's this saga, because I can only describe it really as a saga, lasted 40 years at least. It involved a large group of people in many countries, such as Argentina, Austria, Chile, France, Germany, Italy, Siberia, Switzerland. The preliminary contacts were in 1956. And one of the early contactees was this professor, Bruno Sammarchicha, a well-known and respected Catholic historian. This is Stefano Breccia, who I know and have met on several occasions. This was the photograph of him taken at the time these contacts took place. He said, "All of us were moved by the deep morality and sincere humanity on the part of the aliens," he says. "These were people who simply could not imagine doing anything evil to anyone, who liked eating well, drinking wine, even smoking, who enjoyed playing the violin, in one case, and tennis and driving luxury cars and executive aircraft. They lived most of the time in their huge underground bases, but some of them lived among us inside our society. One of these aliens that was liaising here became a university researcher, another the manager of a rather important textile company in Italy, and a third one was the senior manager of one of the largest German telecommunications companies. Everything was kept secret for decades, but there's a book out called Mass Contacts in English, which I thoroughly recommend to you. It's a very, very confusing story. Be prepared. You have to read through a lot of it. Very confusing story. But Mass Contacts by this man, Stefano Breccio, and Bruno Sammachice, who sadly died before the book was published. Some of the humans were handpicked by the aliens, including this man here, Stefano, who is an expert in artificial intelligence and computer scientists. Others contacted involved, for example, 20 engineers, an archaeologist, accountants, an expert in military logistics, bank employees, 2 members of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, 5 university professors, a Court of Assizes judge, the executive vice president of one of the largest multinational companies in the world, and 2 future Nobel Prize laureates and 4 generals. Those were the people liaising with the aliens. This is Bruno Gibaldi, a very respected aerospace journalist at the time, who himself had many meetings with these people in Italy. A number of these people were taken to their alien bases, which some of them were large. The largest base, underground base, was 186 miles long and 62 miles wide. And I can, maybe if we have some question time later, there certain technology they have which makes it relatively easier to bore out huge spaces underground and elsewhere. Some beautiful women are amongst them. They sometimes have very, very small bases. There are tall, some very, very tall aliens. I'll be showing you one in a minute. This was Alberto Perego, who was a well-known diplomat at the time, who was regularly in touch with these people. And here we have Paolo Di Girolamo, a famous Italian artist who also had regular contacts and took photographs of their craft and so forth. And here we have one of the aliens, one of the very tall ones. His height has been worked out from this photograph at just over 3.7 meters, well over 9 feet tall. And this photograph was taken by Bruno Sammachice, the Catholic historian, in his garden, and tests have been done determining the exact height by knowing the height of this tree at the time and the pine needles and so on and so forth. So is this the real deal, or just an incredible hunk, as some of you might refer to him? There's a great deal to the Amicizia thing, which is really absolutely stunning, and you can yourselves learn about it by getting that book, Mass Contacts. It's very muddled in style, but it's well worth it. Most of you are familiar with Britain's Roswell, 1980, when a craft came down outside the twin United States Air Force bases of Bentwaters and Woodbridge in Suffolk. And at one time, the craft, this was going on several nights, were beaming lights at the nuclear weapons storage area, where there were more nuclear weapons stored than anywhere else in Europe at that time. And the official Ministry of Defense position was that this was of no defense significance. Can you imagine? Unknown craft, one of which, the main one, landed. It's about 15 feet long, as you can see from here. And there's another sketch I have here made by one of the witnesses to the craft when it was sort of upended. But eventually it actually landed flat. And two of the nuclear security policemen actually touched the craft and stood on it before it shot off away in the trees. No defense significance. China. I need to mention that even as far back as 1992, this is a 1985 article talking about a UFO conference in China. As far back as 1992, China, which the UFO Research Association was affiliated with the Science and Technology branch, Association of Scientific and Technical Institute. And they had 3,600 formal members as well as 40,000 research associates. Most of China's UFO researchers are scientists and engineers, and many UFO groups in China require a degree and published research for membership. I think you're familiar with Ronald Reagan's famous comment in the United Nations General Assembly in 1987. We often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bond. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask, is not an alien force already among us? And he just paused for a second, and then he went on to say, of course, what could be more alien to our security than the threat of possible nuclear extinction? But I think he meant something else. Now, more recently, some of you will have seen this on the web. In 1985, the June 11th entry in Reagan's diary states, "Had lunch with 5 top scientists. It was fascinating. Space truly is the last frontier, and some of the developments there in astronomy, etc., are like science fiction, except they are real. I learnt that our shuttle capacity is such that we could orbit 300 people." Now, officially, we certainly don't have shuttles, certainly not back at that time, in 1985, to orbit 300 people. So what was he talking about? Gorbachev, as many of you will know, and we published this before, but some of you may not, at the Geneva summit, Gorbachev confirms the United States president said if the Earth faced an invasion by extraterrestrials, the United States and the Soviet Union would join forces to repel such an invasion. I shall not dispute the hypothesis, though I think it's early yet to worry about such an intrusion. Now, this is a picture taken by Ed Walters in Florida in the late 80s involving Gulf Breeze. Some of you are familiar with it, and I think his pictures are genuine. I spent quite a lot of time with him. I found him genuine. I find this one, for me, a craft about 15 or 16 feet in diameter, taken in Gulf Breeze, I find particularly convincing. Now, yes, 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. Even though we went over time, yeah, we started very late, but anyway, I'll do my best. In 1989, I was approached by the director of a special group associated with Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey, who invited me to become the official consultant on UFO research to a special development group. A personal meeting in Orlando, Florida, was a prerequisite. Well, I couldn't make it, and instead I recommended my friend Bob Exler, who in fact had worked with NASA because NASA was involved in this project, very much so. And he's a former NASA engineer who'd worked on the space shuttle arm. Anyway, he got the job, And his first meetings took place in Orlando in beginning of November 89. And after signing a non-disclosure agreement, he was briefed. The board advisors included former astronauts Alan Bean, Gene Cernan, Charles Conrad, Alexei Leonov, Tom Stafford, and had the approval of President George Bush, Vice President Dan Kale, and the National Space Council, and so forth. And they were going to have a 15,000 square foot traveling space exhibition with 6,000 square feet of UFO-related information. And it was to involve many schools in the United States. It was going to travel worldwide. Well, Bob was sent to the Pentagon in 1989, and he reported to General Stafford, who was the intelligence contact for this. And during that meeting, Stafford talked about presenting things. They talked about all sorts of things, about the shuttle and so forth. But he said, you know, we're thinking of presenting either a facsimile or an actual recovered alien vehicle, and to show some bodies in a cryogenic tank. But, you know, he asked Bob whether he thought, you know, that you should just have model substitutes rather than the real thing, and asked Bob's opinion. Bob said, yeah, let's get the real thing. So there we are, and it goes on and on. A great deal happened. Bob was subsequently taken to, for example, a microgravity chamber area at Ellington Field, NASA Ellington Field in near Houston, where he was actually involved in microgravity experiments with some astronauts, including Alan Bean. He was also taken on an extremely fast helicopter to what he thought was an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, which turned out to be a special monitoring station for alternative spacecraft. That's how they were labeled, ASC, alternative spacecraft. And eventually, other strange things occurred to him. It's a long, drawn-out story. I wrote about it in my book, Alien Liaison, or Alien Contact in the States. But he had some extraordinary information. I'm going to move on here. Later, I went to the National Space Council offices, which is adjoining the White House in what used to be called the old Executive Office building. And I spoke to Colonel Simon Pete Warden there. I think I was expecting, I made a special trip from the UK and all dolled up in my best suit and everything, and I think I was in and out in about 10 minutes. He was very embarrassed, acutely embarrassed by the whole thing, and I said, well, you know, why was it stopped? And he said, well, the Spanish pulled out of it, you know, we couldn't get any money from them, so we decided to drop the whole thing, and so on and so forth. And there is the old Executive Office building. I think it's now called the Reagan Building in D.C. Now, these are actual intelligence community jokes, if you like, but with a degree of solemnness attached to them. Even celestial travel requires a defensive travel security briefing. Okay? How about this? Planning any foreign travel? Don't forget to notify your security office. This is Gennady Manikov, who, together with his colleague on board the Mir space station in 1990, saw a huge silvery iridescent sphere. It was difficult to determine, he said, but the object was at a great altitude over the Earth, perhaps 20, 30 kilometers. It was much larger than the huge ship and had a regular shape, but what it was, I don't know. This was a huge craft seen in Paris by a friend of mine, Gabriel Grellet, France's leading UFO researcher, former Air France pilot, and so forth, and fighter pilot prior to that. This is a craft that was a kilometre long over Paris, seen by him and many, many other witnesses. He was with a whole group of people. And he said it came over silently, and it seemed to carry, or rather, as it came towards them, you couldn't hear anything. Everything stopped. He said it's as if it carried its own zone of silence. This is a photograph taken in Italy in 1993 by Filiberto Caponi, part of a series taken over a series of months. It was only 90 centimeters in height. There was no communication. It was absolutely without any kind of hostility at all. It was, in fact, very, very docile. It had clearly been damaged, very injured very badly, almost certainly burnt. No one knows the circumstances of that at all. And there was no communication, no telepathy, nothing. On each of the occasions it appeared, it would then rush off shrieking. Very, very powerful legs, but seemingly useless arms. A huge craft seen in Canada by numerous witnesses. I have to say, I did quite a lot of investigation into the animal mutilation business, and I've been to Puerto Rico, where a lot of stuff goes on. I've been there 7 times, and on one of the visits, I interviewed, together with Jorge Martin, a security guard who saw an animal, a cow, being beamed up aboard a craft, at which point some American officials came along in a car. This was 2 o'clock in the morning. This was a security guard who'd been working late, and they told him, get lost. Just stay here for 15 minutes, then you can continue on your journey. Well, sure enough, he waited. He wasn't going to argue with them, and 15 minutes later he turned up. He could see that the cow had been dropped beside the road, obviously from a great height. I'll get that back. It's okay. I'm not. Okay. Yeah, when you learn about stories like this, I'm about to tell you, this was January 2004, an Aer Lingus Boeing 737, this actual plane, was on its final approach to Dublin Airport when it was buzzed by a flying triangle, which there were dreadful shards of brilliant violet light coming from it. It caused tremendous turbulence. It caused the plane to be damaged, the air brakes and the skin metal on the wings. And I don't know if it was an emergency landing as such, but certainly the flight crew were very, very frightened indeed. And this was observed by a plane several miles behind. And the next plane that landed at Dublin had encountered the same craft, though the problems weren't so violent as this. Here's a huge craft encountered in Tennessee in October 2000, in Bristol, Tennessee, in October 2004. He suffered nausea, vomiting, lethargy, hair loss, and sunburn. And according to a friend of his I spoke to, who was familiar with finding out exactly, you can sometimes find out exactly who's following a story like this, he said Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and the United States government showed considerable interest in this case on the internet. The witness, Sydney, lost 15 minutes of time. He had had a recently diagnosed brain tumor, and according to my friend, it had disappeared, according to a magnetic resonance imaging scan after this event. In Britain, in 2004, also 2004, not far from the centre of Cambridge, this journalist, Andy Martin of the Independent newspaper, saw a huge craft which filled the sky. It appeared to be a structured craft. And he and his family saw it, and dark outline of a craft, nothing like a plane, definitely jumbo-sized, and it wasn't going up and it wasn't coming down. And that's from a respected news journalist. This photograph was taken in Puerto Rico in, I think it was 1997, I'm not quite sure. No, a bit later, sorry, much more recently than that. I don't have the date with me, but I find it very, very interesting. I think it's a genuine picture. In 2007, 2 airliners in part of the British Isles, they were in the Channel Islands, in French airspace actually, and there was one flying a Trilander here, and he's come forward and said that they saw these 2 craft 2 miles, up to 2, some of them at least a mile, 2 of them a mile in length. And this was confirmed by the pilot and crew and passengers of another airliner flying in the vicinity, 2007. On several occasions, British helicopter police have encountered UFOs which were on near collision course with them in the UK. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Gary McKinnon. For him, he told me that the most important information he uncovered related to the Air Force Space Command. And he said he found a list of Air Force officers, of officers anyway, under the heading non-terrestrial officers. It doesn't mean little green men. What I think it means is not Earth-based. I found a list of fleet-to-fleet transfers and a list of ship names. I looked them up. They weren't US Navy ships. Now, on finding the first image on his PC, Gary told me, the Earth, or at least a blue and white planet with no continents visible, filled 2/3 of the screen. Midway between the camera and the planet hung a cigar-shaped object with geodesic domes above, below, and to the left and right. I didn't see any rivets, seams, or telemetry antennae. This is Paul Hellyer, former defense minister during the Trudeau administration from 1963 to 1967. I'm in touch with him. I was in touch with him recently. He's sending me his book. He's written a book which includes a lot of information about the subject. He stated the classification was from the outset above top secret, so the vast majority of US officials and politicians, let alone a mere allied Minister of Defense, were never in the loop. The United States has developed the aliens' own weapons, lasers and particle guns, to the point where they can be used against the visitors from space. I'm so concerned about what the consequences might be of starting an intergalactic war, and that's why he's chosen to speak up. Ben Rich. He developed the stealth program, very old hat now, very, very old technology, believe me. Now, in 1993, he gave a very important presentation at UCLA, University of California in Los Angeles, at the Department of Engineering, of which he was an alumnus. And 2 alumni, or actually friends of mine, two MUFON researchers were present. And this is what Ben Rich said in 1993, 2 years before he died. We already have the means to travel among the stars, but these technologies are locked up in black projects, and it would take an act of God to ever get them out to benefit humanity. Anything you can imagine, we already know how to do, and that was in 1993. Now, I know you're all expecting a presidential address, disclosure, when the president comes forth and tells you exactly what's going on. Do you seriously think, any of you, that's going to happen? If it does, I mean, who knows? I didn't make it to the White House last time, I'm afraid, but who knows? I thought she was in the running at one stage. Maybe she'll make the big announcement, you know, but do you really think we're going to be told the whole story? Do you think any politician is going to stick their neck out to tell us even half the story? I don't think so. This is our planet, ladies and gentlemen. It's the only one we have at the moment. I can tell you that beings from other worlds, some anyway, races, have been on this planet for longer than we have, and we are a genetic byproduct. We are aliens ourselves. The bad news is that there are many aliens coming and going here. Many of them are visiting, a lot are living here, and many of them are spiritually thousands of years or millions of years ahead of us, and technologically. The bad news is that there are others coming here who I could give you a lot of detail, maybe in question time. I've learned from someone very highly placed about what some of these other critters are up to, but certainly seem to have evil intentions for the human race regarding a hybridization process, and so on and so forth. So, in any event, I think, ladies and gentlemen, you know, it's our only planet at the moment. I can assure you there seem to be efforts to colonize us elsewhere at some point, because maybe we are heading for disaster, not just on a nuclear scale, but everything else points to the possibility. After all, there have been great inundations in the past, changes of continents and so forth. Who knows what's coming up next? Certainly the aliens will have greater knowledge about that, and maybe they're helping us. Who knows? But I will say that I think whatever threat is posed by beings from other worlds, I still fear human beings more. Anyway. It's a great planet. They all say it's unique, not in the galaxy. Obviously, it's unique in our solar system, but it's unique in this particular neck of the Milky Way galaxy, and therefore it is of immense interest to all and sundry. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I bought lots of copies of my books along. It's a very heavy package. I do not want to take them home with me, so you need to know. You need to know, and I need the dough. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Timothy Good.
Thank you.
This was very enlightening.